I was inspired to make this video because of a certain other video. It's probably not what you think. Years ago, as in 8 years ago, SuperCarlinBrothers made 2 videos. First looking at the Jedi Code, and then the Sith Code. And man did they fuck up both videos with how they approached it. Everything about their videos screamed casual fan who doesn't look deeper into things. I watched the video not knowing any better, but nowadays I am more critical of people who don't understand Star Wars and assess things without research. If you're not the kind of person who bothers to read the books, you should at least be watching lore videos and asking around from fans with certain expertise. SuperCarlinBrothers didn't do that though. Instead, they just dive straight in and judge things based on the surface level. Their video was representative of how a lot of people don't understand the Jedi or the Sith or the Force, and them taking things way too literally. I wanted to talk about the first video, talking about the theory that the Jedi are evil. His basis for the theory is to just read off the Jedi Code and assess it on the surface level, and then concluding that the Jedi have problems, talking about all the classic anti-Jedi arguments. As someone who used to fall for it, I am annoyed at these sorts of videos. I know SuperCarlinBrothers is an easy target because they're the same guys who indulged in the theories about who Snoke was or who Rey's parents were, but their anti-Jedi video is a living representation of all the shitty anti-Jedi arguments. Even within the confines of the video and how he approaches it, the best conclusion you can come to is that the Jedi did questionable things in how their standards worked. That's it. The video was pretty much clickbait, but I suppose it wasn't lazy clickbait at least. The editing was quippy and whatnot, but aside from that, I groaned out loud after watching it. The guy admits that he's not very familiar with the expanded universe, which is fine, but Jesus! You could not have fucked up worse than this guy in how he approaches this topic. I think he really should have watched a lore video or asked around from lore buffs beforehand. The first thing he talks about is how the Sith saying that they use the dark side directly and calling it the dark side doesn't mean they're evil. This is a very kindergarten thing to say. Because of course the Sith don't think they're evil, but the thing is, they don't care about morality either, and don't care about names either. They built Sith empires, and we typically define empires as dominating forces, which usually leads to bad things happening. So no shit. He talks about how emotions doesn't make you good or evil, and of course I agree, but the way he looks at this, he's comparing the Star Wars universe and our own. The Force is infinite in its power, and someone who uses it can cause a lot of damage if they use negative emotions extensively. He uses the classic arguments on how Anakin Skywalker wanted to save the person he loves, without acknowledging that he did pretty terrible things to do so. So he uses this sentiment to say that the Jedi forbid love, and that strict rules drove Anakin to madness and whatnot. I've heard this all before. It's a shallow assessment of the story without considering any other factors. He brings out the Jedi Code and does the same, a shallow assessment of it. He goes off the words without looking into the meaning of the words. Like, clearly he does not understand there is no emotion, there is peace.
There is no emotion, there is peace. Aw, peace, that sounds so good, but wait, what was that first part? No emotion? Guess I could do the rest of the video like this. No emotion, are they crazy? I mean, it's kind of hard to wrap your head around, but basically that's a very, like, Spock, Sherlock, logic conquers all the needs of the many out-
Dude, the code doesn't literally mean no emotion all the time in being a sociopath. What no emotion actually means is avoiding strong emotions and putting them aside when adhering to the will of the Force. As explained in another video, the Force is like a self-conscious being that knows greater than any one person. And the Jedi who follow the light side obey the will of the Force. The Jedi know that emotion will always exist. Since the will of the Force brings prosperity where it is prominent in the galaxy, the Jedi actually encouraged positive emotions like love and compassion. That's why Anakin said the Jedi were encouraged to love, but emotional attachments are what was discouraged. How to explain it is that caring for others was a huge part of being a Jedi, but they couldn't get too attached to them, because attachments lead to possessiveness that leads to fear if something goes wrong. Fear is the path to the dark side. Fear leads to anger. anger leads to hate, and hate leads to suffering. And it's not like the Jedi banned all relationships. Jedi commonly made friends within the Order and around the galaxy. And you also have to remember the bond that would form between master and apprentice. Qui-gon and Obi-Wan would have cared about each other in a mentor-student kind of way, but they always made sure to not get too attached to the other. And we see that it's perfectly normal for a Jedi to mourn the deaths of those dear to them. Like with what Obi-Wan did with Qui-gon. They just had to do it in a healthy way, like knowing that they are now one with the Force, as they will one day be. Stuff like that. The reason the Jedi help others is because compassion is a property of the light side. Okay, so next he talks about there is no ignorance, there is knowledge. He seems to talk less about the moral itself, and goes on some weird tangent about the Jedi not sharing the knowledge with the rest of the galaxy, which there's no evidence for, especially in the limited range he's looking at, which is the 6 films in the Clone Wars series, which, by the way, that's a terrible way at looking at the saga. The films, along with Filoni's perceptions stapled on, is a pretty bad way to look at Star Wars. Just like if you included the sequels to the 6-part saga. The story and its meaning radically changes that you're going to get an incorrect idea. But anyways, there being no ignorance but knowledge basically encourages Jedi to constantly expand on what they know, as that's where wisdom comes from. If they know more, they'll know what to do and stave off the threats the dark side poses. In the expanded universe, the Jedi and the Republic did ban Sith artifacts and texts and stuff, but they did that because they were dangerous, and that's why they had them locked away in the archives under high security. Maybe the Jedi and the Republic could have done a better job informing the public on the Sith and why they were dangerous, but you have to consider that by the prequel trilogy, the Sith were mostly ancient history by that point. They last existed to the public 1,000 years ago. That's a long time to most species in the galaxy. Teaching people about the Force in-universe who lived in poorer regions would have been difficult. That's why most of the galaxy didn't really understand the Force and just passed it off as magic that some people could use. That does not equate to the Jedi hoarding knowledge. When it comes to the no passion, only serenity part, the problem he seems to have with this line is the passion part. He thinks that being passionate about keeping the peace is a bad thing to the Jedi, and that it makes no sense, when that's not what that line means. That line of the code encourages Jedi to stay calm and not let passion take over, because passion is a path to attachment. Even in something like keeping the peace, the Jedi should not become passionate in doing so. Why the Jedi don't like passion is that passion can often cause one to become biased and fixated. When I make videos about Star Wars, I am passionate about making said videos, but sometimes I'm too passionate for my own good, and it leads to me neglecting responsibilities and spending way too much time making videos. And in the video making itself, I might not be able to see all parts of a particular argument, for example. Stuff like that is what the Jedi mean when they try to get students to avoid becoming passionate. Being passionate in the real world isn't as bad, but given dark side users like the Sith rely on their passions for their strength, as stated by Anakin Skywalker in Revenge of the Sith, remember that the Star Wars world is not the same as our own. Also, Carlin seems to think that Jedi using lightsabers and being war generals is a contradiction of this idea. It isn't. First, let's start with the lightsaber. Do you just expect the Jedi to walk around without a means of defense all day, every day? The Jedi see the lightsaber as a means of defense, and that's why they use it. We see that in the Star Wars films. Unless it's an openly hostile or dangerous foe, the Jedi always disarm their opponents. In terms of the war general stuff, the Jedi still encourage remaining level-headed during war, although it is very difficult. But the Jedi don't give up on their values during times of war. They still tried to keep themselves open to knowledge, and understand what they were doing, and why they were doing it. There were cases of Jedi who lost their way and fell to the dark side, like Depa Billaba in the novel Shatterpoint, but those who could still clinged on to Jedi values. You also have to remember that the Jedi were going up against droids mainly. Not always, but that was the main fighting force. In my Shatterpoint review, I spoke about how Mace Windu, for example, did not abandon his morals throughout the war. He fought the war while still acting as a Jedi. People think that Yoda shouldn't command armies and whatnot in Attack of the Clones, and I made a video mocking that criticism because if Yoda didn't help, everyone at Geonosis would have died. That's just how it goes. He was protecting the survivors. If you have to fight people to save others, a Jedi is obviously going to do that. They are literally not going to avoid all conflict, because that's ridiculous. Conflict will always be there. It's how the Jedi approach it is how the code kicks in. When he talks about there is no chaos, there is harmony, he speaks the words without understanding them, and goes on about how there's always going to be chaos, and you can't get rid of one without the other and whatnot. That's true, but that's not what the code is talking about. This is a Jedi's guidelines. The code tells Jedi never to create chaos, only to seek balance in all things, and balance means eliminating dark side threats. I'm pretty sure when Jedi destroy dark side threats, it's because they need to. The no chaos rule doesn't literally mean don't destroy anything, because how are they going to get rid of dark side threats otherwise? What this part of the code teaches is for Jedi to not become the very thing they swore to destroy. The Jedi adhering by all the other lines need to destroy chaos, but not cause chaos themselves. The code does not literally mean destroying everything is bad, because how else will balance be restored if you can't get rid of dark side users like Palpatine? Carlin goes on to accuse the Jedi of not trying to better themselves and ignoring chaos out in the galaxy, and again, this is the stupidest thing I've ever heard. Since you don't understand the ignorance knowledge line of the Jedi code, you ignore that the Jedi always seek to better themselves, and they don't just ignore chaos. The Sith were misdirecting at the end of the day. The Clone Wars, as well as the influence of the dark side leading up to that, is what's responsible for clouding the Jedi's vision. So they couldn't detect the threat directly until it was too late. It's all Palpatine's fault. So the only part of the code Carlin agrees with is that there is no death, there is only the Force. And it seems to be the only thing he understands in this entire video. But he recaps all the misconceptions, and he seems to think that the Jedi are like a cult, but they aren't. He says that the Senate bows down to the Jedi when the opposite is true, and is just spouting Sith propaganda. He wholly doesn't understand Jedi ideology or the Force, and goes for simplistic ways of thinking, and it results in terrible misconceptions. So hopefully I've explained the Jedi Code in full. Now it's time to debunk misconceptions about the Jedi. The one thing I want to talk about is that they weren't baby snatchers. Contrary to what even I thought, they had the explicit consent of their parents, who knew that having their child become a Jedi was a great honor. Aside from that, the Jedi were not to blame for Anakin's fall. The Jedi initially refused Qui-Gon's request to train Anakin, and only relented when it was Qui-Gon's dying wish, something the Jedi had to respect. But this was a mistake. Anakin, having outside experiences, became a very untraditional Jedi, forming attachments, growing strong emotions and other traits that show why the Jedi did not usually accept those older than infants as Jedi. So yeah, Luke was wrong in The Last Jedi obviously, and in context too. Another thing I wanted to talk about is that the Jedi helped as many people as they could, but the way the galaxy worked complicated things. For example, slaves in hut space. The reason why they couldn't free slaves is simple. Liberating slaves would cause conflict with the Hutts, and that would cause trouble for the Republic. The Jedi were limited in a lot of ways, like any organization, but they always did what was right when they could. They helped those they could, and those they couldn't were unfortunate, but the Jedi would have helped them if there were no restrictions. This is why Qui-Gon didn't just wipe out Watto and free Anakin just like that. Watto was a legitimate businessman, abiding by local laws that allowed him to own slaves. Qui-Gon acted as a Jedi and just had to deal with it, especially since the Jedi served within the confines of the Republic. The Jedi couldn't do everything, but what they could do, they did, and helped as much as they could. You also have to remember that the Sith hindered the Jedi a lot, which is why they couldn't help as much. The Sith inspired anti-Jedi sentiment. They made things harder for the Jedi. They made many Jedi lose their way, etc. It's all Palpatine's fault. That's what really happened. So that's my through and through explanation on the Jedi and why they were right. Some Jedi may not have abided exactly to the ideology, but in general the Jedi were totally in the right. That doesn't mean that there aren't things you can't criticize about the Jedi. Jolie Bindo and Qui-gon Jinn had their disagreements with the Council, but they were still lightsiders who obeyed the will of the Force and let it guide them. The Jedi were extremely selfless in life. Hopefully I've explained Jedi ideology more clearly in this video, since many tend to grow annoying misconceptions about who the Jedi were and what they did. The Jedi are the good guys, plain and simple. In the next basic lore for dummies video, I am going to discuss the Sith code, as SuperCarlinBrothers also made an extremely misguided and uninformed video where they take the Sith code at face value and never bother to analyze what it actually means. I'm JJ Plagiarisms, and until next time, what are stories but mystery boxes?
Under the mountain, a golden fountain, were you praying at the Loris shrine? But your city lies in dust. Your city